Is this some kind of mistake, sir? Or do you just not understand where you're standing? The guard's voice cut clean through the quiet morning air, sharp enough to turn heads even among men who had spent their lives ignoring noise. And it hung there, just above the gravel path that led into Arlington National Cemetery, where rows of white headstones stretched across rolling green hills under a pale sky, and flags moved slowly in the March wind, each one at half-staff, each one marking a life that had already paid its price. The young corporal stood straight in his dress uniform, posture rigid, jaw set, one gloved hand held out like a barrier as if he alone could hold back history. And in front of him, no more than 3 feet away, stood an old man who looked like he had taken a wrong turn somewhere miles back and simply never corrected it. His suit dark but worn at the seams, his shoes polished but scarred from years that never quite let go, his shoulders slightly stooped yet somehow unmoved, as if gravity had tried and failed to claim him fully. This is a restricted ceremony, the guard continued, louder now, aware of the black sedans pulling up behind him, of the quiet figures stepping out in tailored suits and decorated uniforms, of the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides. Invitation only, and I don't see anything on you that says you belong here. And the words landed with a kind of casual dismissal that would have sent most men turning away without argument. But the old man didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his stance as the wind tugged lightly at the edge of his coat. He simply looked past the guard, past the polished vehicles and the arriving officials, toward the distant rows where the ceremony would soon begin, his pale blue eyes steady, clear, and carrying something deeper than defiance, something quieter and far heavier. The second guard stepped in closer, younger, less patient, his boots crunching against the gravel as he circled just enough to close any imagined gap. "Sir, you're creating a problem," he said, voice edged with irritation now. "I'm going to need you to step aside and head back to the public entrance. It's about a mile down that road." He gestured without looking, already convinced the conversation was over, already certain of his authority. And still, the old man remained exactly where he was, hands at his sides, fingers relaxed, as if he had stood in far worse places and learned long ago that time itself could bend if you refused to rush. A small crowd had begun to notice, subtle at first, a glance here, a pause there, conversations lowering into murmurs as attention drifted toward the quiet standoff at the gate. And among them were officers whose uniforms carried more years than the guards had lived. Yet none of them stepped forward, none of them spoke, because there was something about the stillness of the old man that made interruption feel like a mistake waiting to happen. The corporal exhaled sharply, impatience rising. "Last warning," he said, stepping closer, his shadow cutting across the old man's shoes. "You either show credentials, or you leave. Those are your options." And for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the world seemed to narrow down to that single line drawn in gravel between them. Authority on one side, something older and unspoken on the other. And then the old man finally spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying just enough weight to settle into the space without forcing it. "I'm not here by accident," he said, each word measured, deliberate. "General Caldwell asked me to come." And the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was charged, like the air before a storm that hadn't decided whether it needed to arrive at all. And the guard's expression shifted not to recognition, but to disbelief, a quick smirk forming as he glanced at his partner. "Right?" he muttered, shaking his head slightly. "And I suppose he sent you a personal invitation too." And somewhere behind them, the low rumble of an approaching motorcade began to roll closer, unseen but unmistakable, like something larger had just decided it was time to arrive. The guard's smirk lingered for only a second before it hardened into something sharper, something colder, the kind of expression worn by men who had learned to trust their authority more than their instincts. And Corporal Hayes let out a short breath through his nose, as if dismissing the old man's words entirely. "General Caldwell does not just invite people off the street," he said, his tone no longer amused but edged with irritation. While Private Cole shifted his weight and folded his arms tighter across his chest, mirroring the same disbelief, and behind them the quiet rhythm of arriving vehicles continued, doors closing with soft, deliberate thuds, shoes pressing into gravel, low voices exchanging formal greetings, all of it forming a backdrop that only made the stillness of the old man stand out more. Arthur Bennett did not argue, did not raise his voice, did not reach for anything that might prove his place. He simply stood there with the same calm presence, his gaze drifting briefly toward the distant rows of white markers where the ceremony would soon begin, as if he had already walked that ground 1,000 times in his mind. And there was something in the way he carried himself, something measured and unhurried, that did not match the image the guards had already decided for him. Yet they pushed forward anyway, because to hesitate now would be to admit uncertainty, and uncertainty had no place in a uniform worn this straight. "Sir, I am going to say this one more time." Hayes stepped closer, his polished shoes grinding lightly against the gravel as he closed the space between them. "You are not on the list, you do not have credentials, and you are delaying a high-level military funeral, so you need to step away, now." And the words came out practiced, clean, built from repetition rather than reflection, while Arthur's hands remained at his sides, relaxed, fingers slightly curled, not in tension but in patience, as if he had heard far worse demands in far worse places and learned that volume did not equal authority. A breeze moved across the cemetery then, stronger this time, carrying with it the faint sound of distant flags snapping and the soft rustle of uniforms shifting, and for a brief moment the sunlight caught the edge of something small on Arthur's lapel, a dull piece of metal no larger than a coin, tarnished and uneven, pinned slightly off-center as if it had never been meant for display, and Private Cole noticed it first, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in just enough to get a better look. "What is that supposed to be?" he muttered under his breath before straightening again, the question not yet loud enough to break the moment, but planted like a seed of curiosity mixed with ridicule, the crowd behind them grew thicker now, more eyes turning, more whispers passing between ranks and titles, yet still no one stepped forward, because something about the scene felt unfinished, like a story waiting for the wrong line to be spoken. And in the middle of it all, Arthur Bennett remained exactly as he was, unmoved by the tension building around him, his silence not empty but deliberate, the kind of silence that suggested he was not waiting for permission, only for time to catch up with the truth, already standing in front of them. And when he finally spoke again, it was no louder than before, no sharper, just steady. "I am not delaying anything," he said, his eyes returning to Hayes without challenge, without fear. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." And the certainty in his voice did not rise, did not push, but it settled into the air in a way that made the space feel smaller, tighter, as if something unseen had just shifted beneath the surface. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Corporal Hayes hesitated, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for doubt to flicker briefly behind his eyes before discipline forced it back into place, because rules were clear, lists were absolute, and old men with no credentials did not belong at the center of history, no matter how calmly they stood. The hesitation lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was there, and Private Cole saw it, just a flicker in Corporal Hayes's posture before it vanished behind discipline, and that was enough to irritate him more than the old man's calm ever could. Because doubt had no place here, not today, not at a funeral that carried the weight of generals and history, and he stepped forward without waiting, closing the distance until he stood almost shoulder to shoulder with Arthur Bennett, his voice sharper, now louder, meant to reclaim control not just of the situation but of the narrative forming around them. "You think saying a name is going to change anything," he said, a thin edge of mockery cutting through his words. "We have procedures for a reason. And right now you are standing in the wrong place at the wrong time." And a few of the onlookers shifted, their attention no longer casual but fixed, drawn in by the rising tension that no one had yet resolved. Arthur did not respond immediately, and that silence stretched just long enough to make Cole press harder, to fill the space with something that felt like authority. "You do not have a badge, you do not have a pass, and you are holding up a ceremony for a 4-star general," he continued, emphasizing the rank as if it alone should end the conversation, while Hayes straightened beside him, reinforcing the stance even as something in the back of his mind refused to settle. The breeze moved again, stronger this time, carrying with it the low hum of engines from the approaching motorcade, closer now, heavier, a presence that could be felt before it was fully seen, and still Arthur stood exactly where he had been, his eyes calm, his expression unchanged, as if the escalation around him belonged to another world entirely. "Sir," Hayes said again, this time more controlled, more deliberate, stepping in to reassert order. "I am giving you a direct instruction. Step back from the gate." And as he spoke, his gaze dropped briefly, just for a fraction of a second, to the small piece of metal on Arthur's lapel, that dull, uneven pin that did not belong on any uniform he recognized. And something about it lingered in his thoughts longer than it should have, because it was not polished, not official, not something issued by any system he trusted. And yet it was worn with a quiet certainty that did not match its appearance. Private Cole noticed the glance and followed it, his curiosity now turning into something more open, more dismissive, and without asking, without pausing, he reached out, two fingers extending toward the pin as if it were nothing more than a loose thread on a jacket. "What is this supposed to be?" he said, louder now, inviting the nearby crowd into the moment, his tone carrying that same casual disrespect that had started it all. And his hand hovered just inches away from the metal, close enough to catch the light that revealed its rough edges, its uneven surface, something handmade, something old. Arthur's eyes shifted then, not quickly, not sharply, but with a subtle focus that locked onto that movement. And for the first time there was a change, not in his posture, not in his stance, but in the air around him, as if something long buried had just been touched without permission. And though his voice remained low when he spoke, it carried a weight that cut clean through the noise of the gathering crowd. "Do not touch that," he said, and the words were not loud, not aggressive, but they landed with a clarity that made Cole pause mid-motion, his fingers still hovering in the air, caught between arrogance and something he could not quite name, while behind them the distant line of black vehicles finally came into view. At the edge of the road, moving slowly, deliberately, toward the gate, and the moment that had been building since the first word was spoken tightened further, as if the entire scene had been waiting for exactly this line to be crossed. Private Cole froze for a fraction of a second, his fingers suspended just inches from the small piece of metal, caught between the instinct to pull back and the pride that refused to yield, and the silence that followed Arthur Bennett's words seemed to press inward from every direction, tightening the space around them until even the distant hum of the approaching motorcade felt muted, as if the world itself had leaned in to listen. Then the moment broke, not with understanding, but with a scoff, a short, dismissive sound that Cole forced out as he withdrew his hand just enough to feign control. "Relax," he muttered, straightening up, though his eyes lingered on the pin longer than before, something about its worn surface refusing to fit into the neat categories he relied on, and that uncertainty irritated him more than anything else, so he doubled down, louder now, for the benefit of the growing crowd. "It looks like scrap metal, sir, nothing official, nothing that gets you past this gate." And a few quiet murmurs rippled behind them. Not laughter, not agreement, just the uneasy sound of people sensing a line that had been crossed without fully understanding why. Arthur did not respond to the insult, did not defend the object or explain it, his hand remaining still at his side, but his gaze held steady on Cole for a moment longer before drifting again toward the rows beyond the gate, as if the conversation in front of him had already lost its importance, and that calm dismissal only sharpened the edge in Hayes's posture as he stepped forward again, reclaiming his position between Arthur and the entrance. "Enough," he said, voice firm, controlled. "This is not a debate. You have been instructed to leave." And the authority in his tone was clearer now, reinforced by the presence of more officers arriving behind him, their uniforms catching the light, their conversations slowing as they approached the scene, drawn in despite themselves. The line of black vehicles rolled closer, tires crunching softly over the gravel road, each one moving with measured precision, and the first of them began to slow near the entrance, their polished surfaces reflecting the rows of white markers like silent witnesses, while a senior officer stepped out from one of the earlier arrivals, his eyes scanning the gate with a practiced awareness that missed very little. Yet even he paused when he saw the standoff, his attention lingering just long enough to register that something was not aligned. Arthur Bennett remained unmoved, the wind catching the edge of his jacket again, revealing for a brief second the faint outline of an old seam repaired by hand, a detail so small, It would have gone unnoticed if not for the stillness surrounding him. And when he finally spoke again, it was not to argue, not to plead, but simply to repeat what had already been said, his voice unchanged, steady as ever. "I am not leaving," he said, and there was no challenge in it, no raised volume, just a quiet certainty that did not bend under pressure. Hayes's jaw tightened at that, the last thread of patience beginning to fray as the situation stretched beyond what protocol comfortably handled, and he shifted his stance, preparing to act, to enforce the boundary that had been drawn, because hesitation now would only invite more questions, more attention, more uncertainty, and none of that belonged here. Not today, not in front of the arriving dignitaries and the silent rows beyond. And yet, as he reached for his radio, as he prepared to escalate the situation into something official, something documented and controlled, the sound of the motorcade finally reached the gate in full, engines idling low, doors opening in unison, and for a brief moment, just before anything else could be said or done, the entire scene seemed to hold its breath, balanced on the edge of something none of them could yet see. The doors of the lead vehicle opened with a quiet precision that carried more authority than any raised voice, and the ripple it sent through the gathered crowd was immediate. Conversations cutting off mid-sentence, posture shifting, eyes turning toward the motorcade as if drawn by instinct rather than instruction, while Corporal Hayes instinctively stepped back half a pace, not in retreat, but in recognition of something larger now entering the scene. And Private Cole straightened beside him, his earlier confidence tightening into something more rigid, more formal, though his gaze flicked once more toward the small, tarnished pin on Arthur Bennett's lapel, unable to fully dismiss it. A senior officer emerged first, his uniform immaculate, ribbons aligned with a precision that spoke of decades rather than years, and his eyes moved quickly across the gate, assessing, measuring, pausing just long enough when they landed on the old man standing exactly where he had been since the beginning, unmoved by the shift in atmosphere. And there was a subtle change in the officer's expression, not recognition, not yet, but a flicker of curiosity that did not match the dismissal shown by the guards. "What is the delay here?" the officer asked, his voice calm but carrying the kind of weight that did not require volume. And Hayes responded immediately, posture snapping into place. "Sir, unidentified civilian attempting to enter a restricted ceremony without credentials, refusing to comply with instructions." The report was clean, efficient, exactly as trained, and for a moment it seemed sufficient, enough to resolve the situation and move forward. But the officer's gaze did not leave Arthur, lingering instead on the quiet stillness that did not fit the description he had just been given. Arthur did not acknowledge the officer directly, did not step forward or offer explanation, his attention remaining fixed beyond the gate, as if the unfolding exchange around him was merely a passing detail. And that absence of reaction created a tension that words could not quite fill, while the wind shifted again, lifting the edge of his jacket just enough for the small metal pin to catch the light once more, its surface uneven, its edges worn, something clearly not issued, not standardized, and yet carried with a care that suggested it mattered far more than its appearance allowed. Private Cole noticed the officer's lingering glance, and, eager to reinforce control, spoke again, his tone still edged. With that same dismissive certainty. "We already checked, sir. There is nothing on him, no identification, no authorization, just that thing." He gestured briefly toward the pin, reducing it to an object without meaning, something easily dismissed, but as his hand moved, as his finger pointed, the officer's eyes followed it, focusing now on the small piece of metal with a sharper attention than before. And for a brief moment the space seemed to narrow again, the noise of the arriving dignitaries fading into the background as something quieter, more precise took its place. Arthur's eyes shifted then, not toward the officer, but toward the gesture itself, toward the hand that had once again drawn attention to the pin. And though his expression remained calm, there was a weight behind it now, something deeper than patience, something that had been carried for far longer than the moment unfolding at the gate. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, steady, unchanged by the presence of rank or authority. "It is not for you," he said, not as a correction, not as a challenge, but as a simple truth, and the words settled into the air with a quiet finality that did not invite argument. The officer held his gaze for a second longer, then another, as if searching for something beneath the surface that the report had missed, and behind him the rest of the motorcade continued to arrive, doors opening, figures stepping out, the weight of ceremony building, yet the focus remained here, at the gate, on a man who did not belong according to the system, and yet did not move as if he had any intention of leaving. And in that stillness, in that refusal to bend, something began to shift, subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but enough to make the officer pause before giving his next command, as if, for the first time since the morning began, he was no longer entirely certain who, exactly, was standing in the wrong place. The officer did not speak right away, and that silence stretched just long enough to shift the balance of the moment, his eyes still fixed on Arthur Bennett, as if weighing something that had not yet been said, while behind him the steady rhythm of the ceremony continued to assemble, more vehicles arriving, more uniforms stepping into place, the quiet precision of a military funeral unfolding. In layers. Yet here at the gate time seemed to slow, held in place by a question no one had fully formed. "Sir," Hayes said again, more carefully now, aware of the attention settling on them. "We can remove him if necessary." And the offer was delivered with the same discipline as before, but without the earlier certainty, as if the words themselves no longer felt entirely solid. The officer did not respond to Hayes, his gaze lowering instead, drawn once more to the small, tarnished pin, and this time he took a step closer, not aggressively, not with authority, but with a quiet intention that carried its own weight. And though he did not reach for it, the distance between them closed just enough for him to see the fine details that had been missed before, the uneven edges, the slight bend along one side, the faint scratches that spoke not of neglect but of time. And something in those details stirred a recognition not of the object itself, but of what it represented. Arthur did not move, did not react to the closer inspection, his eyes shifting slightly, as if tracking something far beyond the present. And for a brief moment the sound of the cemetery faded for him, replaced by something older, something carried in memory rather than heard in the air, the distant hum of rotor blades cutting through thick humidity, the weight of heat pressing down in waves, the smell of damp earth and metal mingling in a place far removed from the ordered rows of white stone. The pin had not always been dull, had not always been worn, and the moment it had been given had not been quiet or ceremonial, but it had been clear, unmistakable, a single act marked not by rank or recognition, but by survival, by a promise made in a place where promises were the only things that held. The officer's voice, when it finally came, was softer than before, less certain. "Where did you get that?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a question that had already begun to answer itself, and Arthur's gaze returned to him slowly, deliberately, the present settling back into focus without haste. "It was given," he said, and that was all. No explanation, no elaboration, just a simple statement that carried a weight far beyond its words. Behind them, Private Cole shifted again, uneasy now, the earlier confidence replaced by something he did not want to name, while Hayes remained still, his posture rigid but his attention no longer entirely fixed on enforcement. And in the growing crowd, a few of the older officers exchanged glances, subtle, almost imperceptible, as if something in the air had changed in a way they recognized but could not yet confirm. The motorcade engines idled lower now, the sound settling into a steady hum as the final vehicles came to a stop. And for a moment the entire scene seemed suspended between two realities, one defined by protocol and order, the other by something older, something that did not need permission to exist, and at the center of it stood a man who had not moved, who had not raised his voice, and who had not once asked to be let in, as if the truth of his presence did not depend on whether the gate opened or remained closed, only on whether those standing in front of it were ready to see it. The question did not fade after it was asked. It lingered in the air with a weight that seemed to settle into every pair of eyes now fixed on the small, tarnished piece of metal, and the officer straightened slowly, his expression no longer neutral but sharpened by a quiet recognition that had not yet fully surfaced. While Arthur Bennett remained still, his answer offered and finished, as if no further explanation was required. and that absence of detail only deepened the tension rather than easing it. Somewhere behind the line of guards, a young captain who had been standing near the edge of the gathering shifted his stance, his name tag reading Ward, his posture relaxed but his attention fully locked onto the exchange, and unlike the others, he was not focused on the confrontation itself but on the details that did not align. The stillness of the old man, the weight behind his voice, the way the officer had paused when he saw the pin, and something in Ward's experience, something earned rather than taught, began to press against his instincts, telling him that this was not a situation to be resolved by protocol alone. He took a step back from the crowd, subtle enough to avoid drawing attention, his hand moving toward his pocket as he turned slightly away, his eyes still tracking the scene even as his body shifted out of it. And with practiced ease he pulled out his phone, shielding it from view with his palm as he scrolled quickly through a list of contacts that most men in his position would not have had, because Ward had learned long ago that sometimes the fastest way to solve a problem was not to argue it, but to ask the right person the right question. The line connected after only a brief pause, and his voice dropped low, controlled, urgent without sounding alarmed. "Colonel Markison, sir, this is Captain Ward at Arlington. We have a situation at the main gate." He listened for a second, his eyes narrowing slightly as he chose his words carefully. "There is an elderly man here, no credentials, claims he was invited personally by General Caldwell. Name is Arthur Bennett." The name hung there for a fraction of a second before continuing. "Sir, I know how that sounds, but something is not right. I cannot explain it, but I think you need to check it." And there was a pause on the other end, longer than expected, long enough for Ward's grip on the phone to tighten slightly. Because silence from a man like Markison was never empty, it meant something was moving behind it. Back at the gate, Hayes and Cole remained locked in their positions, though neither spoke, their earlier confidence now replaced by a quiet tension they could not fully justify, while the senior officer kept his attention on Arthur, as if waiting for something else to surface, something just out of reach, and the crowd behind them had gone almost completely still, conversations reduced to whispers, the weight of the moment pressing down as the motorcade idled only yards away. Ward turned slightly, lowering his voice even further as the call resumed. "Sir," he said, slower now, more deliberate. "Does the name Arthur Bennett mean anything to you?" And this time the silence that followed was different, not uncertain, not questioning, but heavy, deliberate, the kind of silence that comes when a name lands exactly where it is supposed to, and Ward felt it immediately, the shift passing through the line before a single word was spoken, and though he could not yet hear the response, he already knew that whatever came next was going to change everything standing at that gate. The silence on the other end of the line did not break immediately, and Captain Ward felt it settle into his chest like a weight he could not yet measure, his eyes still fixed on the unmoving figure of Arthur Bennett at the gate, while around him the ceremony continued to assemble in quiet precision, unaware that something far more significant was unfolding just a few yards away. Then the voice came back, no longer casual, no longer routine, but tight, controlled, and unmistakably alert. "Say the name again," Colonel Markison said, and Ward did not hesitate. "Arthur Bennett, sir," he repeated, slower this time, each syllable clear, and there was another pause, shorter now but heavier, followed by a sharp exhale that carried more meaning than any explanation. "Do not let him leave," Markison said, the words low but absolute. "I want eyes on him. I am making a call." And the line went dead before Ward could respond. Ward lowered the phone slowly, his grip tightening for a moment as the implication settled in, not confusion, not uncertainty, but confirmation that something had just shifted at a level far above anything visible at the gate. And he turned back toward the scene, his posture changing, subtle but undeniable, no longer that of an observer, but of someone who now understood that the balance of the situation had moved. At the gate, Hayes remained in position, though his stance had softened just slightly, the rigid certainty from earlier replaced by a tension he could not fully explain, while Private Cole stood beside him, quieter now, his earlier dismissiveness fading under the growing weight of attention pressing in from every direction, and the senior officer who had first approached had not moved away, his gaze still resting on Arthur with a focus that suggested he was waiting, not for an answer, but for something to arrive. The motorcade engines idled steadily, a low, constant hum that filled the background like a distant storm, and then, without warning, one of the vehicles further back in the line shifted position, its door opening again, but this time with a different kind of movement, not routine, not ceremonial, but immediate, purposeful, and a ripple moved through the nearby officers as they noticed it, posture adjusting, conversations cutting off, attention redirecting toward the new arrival. Ward stepped forward. Now, closing the distance toward Hayes, his voice low but firm as he spoke just within earshot. "Hold your position," he said, not as a suggestion but as a quiet directive, and Hayes glanced at him, confusion flickering for a second before discipline forced him to comply, because something in Ward's tone carried a certainty that outranked the situation even if it did not outrank the uniform. Arthur Bennett did not move, did not react to the shift in attention, his gaze still set beyond the gate, as if everything happening now had already been decided long before this moment, and the small, tarnished pin on his lapel caught the light once more as the wind moved across the cemetery, a silent detail that now seemed to hold more meaning than anyone had first assumed. And as the figure from the motorcade stepped fully into view, surrounded by an immediate and unmistakable shift in posture from those nearby, the atmosphere changed again, not gradually this time, but all at once, like a line had been crossed that no one at the gate had the authority to draw. And for the first time since the confrontation began, the question was no longer whether the old man belonged there, but who among them had failed to recognize it soon enough. The man who stepped out of the vehicle did not raise his voice, did not announce himself, and yet the effect was immediate. Officers who had been standing at ease straightened without being told, conversation stopped entirely, and a path seemed to form instinctively as he moved forward with a pace that was neither rushed nor delayed, but deliberate, controlled, and absolute. And General Thomas Ridgway did not look at the crowd, did not acknowledge the guards, his focus fixed on a single point, ahead of him as if everything else had already been accounted for. Corporal Hayes felt it before he fully saw it, that shift in presence that could not be ignored, and his posture snapped tighter, his earlier authority now replaced by a quiet awareness that he was no longer the one in control of the situation. While Private Cole stood rigid beside him, his eyes following the approaching figure with a growing unease he could not hide, the general reached the gate without breaking stride, his gaze moving past Hayes and Cole without pause, as if they were no longer part of the equation. And then he stopped, exactly 2 steps in front of Arthur Bennett, the distance precise, intentional, and for a brief moment neither man spoke, the silence stretching out in a way that felt heavier than anything that had come before. Because this was no longer a confrontation, it was recognition waiting to be completed. Arthur did not step forward, did not adjust his stance. He simply looked at the general with the same calm expression he had held from the beginning, and something in that stillness seemed to settle the space around them, as if the tension that had built over the past minutes had finally found its center. Then, without a word, General Ridgway raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate motion and rendered a full salute, not to the ceremony, not to the crowd, but to the man standing in front of him, and the effect was immediate and total. A wave of silence that moved outward in every direction. Officers froze where they stood. Conversations died mid-breath, and even the wind seemed to pause as the meaning of the moment settled in. Hayes felt it like a physical weight, his mind struggling to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he had believed just moments before, and beside him Cole's expression shifted from confusion to something closer to realization, his earlier words now echoing in a way that felt far too loud in the quiet that followed. Arthur Bennett did not return the salute right away, not out of hesitation, but with the same measured timing he had carried through every moment of the encounter. And when he finally raised his hand, the motion was slower, deliberate, carrying the weight of years that did not need to be explained, and for a brief second the 2 men stood in perfect stillness, the gesture completed not as a display, but as something far more personal, something that did not belong to the crowd watching it. General Ridgway lowered his hand first, his voice quiet when he finally spoke, but carrying across the silence with complete clarity. "You should have been escorted in the moment you arrived," he said, not as an apology, but as a correction of something that should never have happened. And he turned then, his gaze moving briefly to Hayes and Cole, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a weight that made both men stand even straighter, understanding without needing explanation that they had misjudged something far beyond their authority. Then he stepped aside, a small movement, but one that carried the force of a command, opening the path through the gate. And this time there was no hesitation, no request, no barrier, because the decision had already been made at a level none of them could override. Arthur Bennett moved forward at last, his step steady, unhurried, passing through the gate without looking back, the small tarnished pin catching the light one final time as he crossed into the rows beyond. And behind him the silence remained, not empty, but filled with a single realization that settled into every person who had witnessed it. That respect is not granted by appearance, and it is never measured by what can be seen at first glance, because some men carry their history quietly, and the world only recognizes it when it is finally forced to stop and look.